Okay, we're back with 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And Paul, as we just read, wrote, "For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and be exhorted." And Paul explained how they were to do that, as you probably saw in the last video, by explaining how each has a psalm, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, and interpretation, but that all should be done decently and in order for the edification of the church. And Paul explains that they are to speak in turn by 2 or 3 at the most, and others are to judge. Or in the case of tongues and interpretation, they are to speak 2 or 3 by inspiration, and then the interpreter is to interpret. And Paul says, "But if revelation is made to one who's seated, then the first should keep silent." In other words, they should be able to continuously take turns as they're inspired by the Spirit, and they would need to know who has which gift. They would need to know, for example, which member of the body has the gift of interpretation. And all of that was explained in the last video. So anyway, in verse 33, Paul concludes and he says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." So let me ask, where do you think this process of speaking by the Spirit in turn, and where do you think the recognition of the gifts given to the body, not one man, the body, not the apostle, the body, where did all that take place? God is not the God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches. Context here is not just that this was to be at the church at Corinth, but this would have been at the church in Ephesus, at the church in Philippi, at the church in Colossia, at the church in Lystra, at the churches in Galatia, Antioch, Derbe, all of the churches. If it was good enough for the apostles, is it good enough for us? I think so. And so Paul writes, "The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, as the law also says." Now, if you remember, in chapter 11, Paul gave the description of how women were to respectfully prophesy and to preach. So we cannot take this verse out of context and use it as a blanket statement. This verse had the meaning within a particular context. And we do know from the previous verse, women did prophesy, and they did pray in the church. That was in chapter 11. And so the Apostle Paul, in verse 35, he says, "If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for women to speak in church." Probably the women had questions, which is natural. And instead of burdening the service with many questions, the women could ask their husbands at home, and their husbands could explain the answer, which shows a correlation to the statement that Paul wrote, I believe, to Timothy, "For Adam was formed first and then Eve." In other words, that was the event of physical creation, but in spiritual realm, maybe the application is that the apostles focused on developing the men before the women. And so the men could share with their wives and their children. "Was it from you that the word of God first went forth, or has it come to you only?" In other words, Corinthians, you're not the only one that's received the word of the Lord. In other words, the Corinthians should not think that they are super elite spiritually. And so the Apostle Paul goes on to say in verse 37, "If anyone thinks he is a prophet, or spiritual, let him recognize that the things which I write to you are the Lord's commandments. 14:37, 1 Corinthians. Remember, I asked him earlier in the series, how do we know that Paul's instructions are authoritative? Remember in 11:2, he said, I praise you because you remember me in everything, and you hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. The question is, how do we know that these traditions are authoritative? Well, right here in verse 37, chapter 14, Paul raises the ante. If anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things which I write to you are the Lord's commandments. The Lord, not a seminary's commandment, not a pastor, not the apostles' commandments. They're the Lord's commandments. Now, if we're going to recognize Jesus as Lord, as a church, if we're going to say he's head over the body, is he? Do we acknowledge him as head indeed? Between chapters 11, 12, and 13, the Apostle Paul refers to the assembling of the church again and again and again. The coming together of the church again and again and again. The meeting of the church again and again. And Paul speaks of the Lord's Supper, the Agape love feast of the Christians. And Paul speaks of spiritual gifts and the dispersion of grace through the body, and the subject of love in the context of the ministry of spiritual gifts. In other words, without love, prophecy is like an empty clanging. And all of that is given, and Paul explains how they're to minister by the gifts. So we have the Agape feast, the Lord's Supper, the ministry of spiritual gifts, all in the context of when believers come together as a church. And we have instructions even on how the spiritual gifts are to be exercised. Speaking one by one. What we don't see here is anything about a pastor. What we don't see is anything about a quote, sermon. Now I know this is going to just throw people. Well, you don't believe in the sermon? What am I doing? I'm making a sermon. The thing is that the teaching ministry of the church was targeted. The apostles taught from house to house. And it was targeted to people as they needed it at their level. And the preaching ministry of the church was targeted to people who were not saved. And it can be shown that the church even maintained a ministry to the widows, and we could conclude even to orphans at a community level. But what we cannot say is that all of this happened Sunday morning in one bowl of wax. That's one thing we can't say. We might do it. Protestants may have done it. Catholics may have done it. We can't say the apostles did that. What we have to look at is what we do at a church level, what the early Christians did under the command of the apostles, under the authority of the apostles, and by the commandments of Jesus Christ. When your church comes together, do all speak by the Spirit in turn? Do you know who has what gift? Do you commemorate the death of the Lord through the Lord's Supper? And do you experience the resurrection of Christ through the gifts of the Spirit that have been distributed in the body? We have to see if what we do squares up with what the apostles taught, because faith is based on what God has said.